Wow. Hi. This evening's presentation is going to focus on what did the anti-slavery, abolitionist, and or Underground Railroad movement look like in Livonia Township. So the township is different from Livonia, which comes along as a city, and I know that Livonia is getting ready to celebrate so many years as a city. But the city evidently adopted its name from the township. So in this place or this space in Wayne County in which we are located, there are 4 key townships where our history, it intersects with one another. The history, which is the county or township in the 19th century would have been Natkins, which is modern day Westland. And if we travel further west, we have what we call, that would be parallel with us in the 19th century, Plymouth Township. And then due south of that is Canton Township. But Livonia Township in the 19th century, and sometime I'll slip and say Livonia, so please forgive me, it also shares a border with Oakland County. So keep in mind that 8 Mile is what it's called in its present time versus Baseline, which is its toll road name, was a fluid road. So you had families who were living in Oakland County, primarily in Farmington, who are related and who are working with the abolitionists in this community. I will introduce you to some, not all, because this story cannot be told in 45 minutes. This is the kind of work that I've been doing for more than 30 years in regards to researching the stories of abolitionists, black and white, freedom seekers, which is the term that the historical community uses for fugitives, just to address their agency, their importance of their stories, as well as the abolitionists. So it's going to be a mixture of a little bit of history, what's going on with Michigan, why Livonia Township, and what actually happens in this township in regards to the abolitionists who are living here, who are primarily farmers, and the commitment that they made in wanting to end slavery in the United States. This presentation will be available to you in an abridged version, and I actually have a link that you can link to after the presentation, and the library will have a copy only of the full presentation. Unfortunately, I've learned that I've had to do that because if I leave the full presentation online, I have found presentations that I have done in the past, they have erased my name, put somebody else's name on it, and they're selling it on a website. So it has taken me, the website's a really dark place. So let's get ready and let's go and let's find out the history of early Livonia. I also ask that during the presentations, please make sure your phones are silenced so that we don't interrupt our neighbors. I'm fine. And that I do ask that there's no photography, no videotaping, and no recording of the presentation. The presentation will also be available to you in full, in its full presentation, also through the library. We are videotaping this evening, so when you want to clap, just kind of clap it up a little bit. And we're going to make it available on YouTube. So you will have access to all of the information I will show you this evening. So let's start with the road to Michigan. Why Michigan? We are often, believe it or not, I have presented at national historical conferences, and people often say, Michigan? I didn't know that the Underground Railroad ran through Michigan. Because so much of the literature that is written in this field, I love him as a historian, and his name is Eric Foner, but there's such a heavy concentration of the Underground Railroad movement on the Atlantic states, the New England states, because that's primarily where you have some of your key agitators are on the East Coast. But keep in mind, Ohio and Michigan become very important in this movement of the abolitionist movement. Because one, Ohio is a border state to 3 slave states, and then freedom just doesn't end in Ohio. That's where Michigan's role come in. And not only are freedom seekers coming in through Ohio, let's not forget our neighboring major city in the state of Illinois, Chicago. Chicago, they're finding ways to send freedom seekers not only over land, but also the Great Lakes. So with that being said, we're going to look at how Michigan becomes a sanctuary, just like Canada does. And we're going to look at our abolitionists in this community who really put their heart, body, mind, souls, and financial contributions to the movement in Western Wayne County. So I always like to start out with one of my dear friends who works at the University of Detroit Mercy, and he's an emeritus instructor, and that's Dr. Roy Finkenbein. He and I present quite a bit together, and at the last presentation back in September when he and I were together, people gave us glowing reviews, and we got like 4.8s and 4.9s for our presentation. But the one thing that people were a little concerned with is we didn't talk about the quilts. So I thought it would be extremely important to not just address the quilt issue, but also to address some of the myths and the misinformation about the Underground Railroad. What you see on the presentation up here are just some of the things that I often hear when I'm traveling about in regards to the Underground Railroad, that it was actual tunnels and trains ran on the ground, that it was the Quakers and them alone who organized this massive system of transporting freedom seekers to freedom, as well as the one biggest myth and misinformation about the Underground Railroad is the quilts. Now, I don't want to break nobody's heart in here, but I've been in situations where some people just don't want to believe me, and I don't challenge them on that. I said, that's fine if you feel that way. But why did the quilt code take off in such a mass kind of production? It's because when you have the Oprah Winfrey touch, you actually have the opportunity to go places that nowhere else people can go. So it starts in 1999 with the publication of this book called Hidden in Plain View by 2 individuals. Dr. Dobar is an academic, but he is a specialist in art, and Jacqueline Tobin, and not that degrees have anything to do with it, but this is not her area of expertise or study. Long story short, she was told a story by an African-American woman in Charleston, South Carolina, and who revealed some information on her about codes being signs and symbols that escaped fugitives used, as well as abolitionists hung outside of their windows or on their clotheslines that enslaved individuals would use to move from space to space. The reason why historians do not buy into the myth is because it has not been proven by what we call evidence. Tobin's conversation was just that, a conversation, and that's not to take away from the woman who told her the story to make sure that it may have been true for her family. But historians who study this work like I do, more than 30 years, who have read the stories of what the abolitionists or the Underground Railroad operatives have said, and when you read what the freedom seekers themselves are saying, yes, quilts are used, but they're used for utility purposes, for warmth, for keeping me warm. And I try to explain to people that when you understand the condition in which these African Americans were escaping in, I doubt very seriously when they're walking around in April, and you know the weather can be muddy, cold, snow, and bare feet soaking wet, that they're gonna leave a blanket on the line and not pick it up. So there are some things that are just kind of common sense. But what happened with the quilt codes is without verification of the source. And you know, the quilt museums, we have two wonderful national quilt museums. One is in Paducah, Kentucky, and the other one I think is out west somewhere. And they will not even subscribe to the quilt code project or myth, primarily because half of the symbols that this book claims were used on the Underground Railroad, they don't even come into existence until the Civil War or after. Two of the quilt codes are not even used by quilters, or when they think they were actually created, not until the 20th century. So part of the problem is that the quilt code has been the biggest myth because it has entered K-12 education. And I'll be lecturing to teachers this month also in regards to strategies for teaching this genre of history. Also, what has put it in the category of when people don't know, Tobin's book is always the go-to book. And I ask people, say, well, what else are you using? Have you vetted her sources? What methodology are you coming to? They can't tell you. Because in my field, anybody can call themselves a historian. You know, family historians, local historians, oral historians. So that's why sometimes I just say I'm an academic historian, because my training in regards to how I go about finding out stories, I don't leave you in the dark, because you can go find the information too, or I will guide you to it. Then it came out with what? Children's books. These are the books that continued the story on the quilt codes, because we got to have a nice story about the freedom seekers escaping slavery and getting help from operatives. But what people don't understand is that if you were the freedom seeker, or if you were the individual who operated an underground station or an Underground Railroad operative, keep in mind you were breaking a federal law, the 1793 Fugitive Slave Law. So you were breaking a federal law. So with whites who worked on the Underground Railroad, they could get prison time, and some did. There were trials, and they had to pay up for assisting freedom seekers, especially if an owner didn't get their property back. Some got hard time, and we have one here in the state of Michigan who did get hard time in prison for 5 years. He moved to Michigan, and before he's released, a hot iron is placed on his hands, and 2 letters are burnt inside of his hands, and the letters were SS, slave stealer. So this is a violent system. You know, this is not a ride like going to Disneyland and woo, we all get on and feel good when we get off. This is a movement that has moved swiftly, quickly, and only a few people could trust individuals to help them out. So once again, you know, it got into comic books. If you look at this was a movie series, and you know, historians of my literature, we were really excited because it kind of turned people on to the Underground Railroad, but just so much of the made-up parts of it just made it kind of difficult to swallow. This is probably one of the most popular books that has been written within the probably last 5 to 6 years. It's nonfiction, but it's fiction, but some people take it for what? Nonfiction, because it has the Underground Railroad tunnels. And then our quilting community, because I'm a quilter, they really took to it. And they started making quilt code books from this book that had the pattern. So I say all that to say, this is not an easy type of history where there's one archive and one location. Its history is spread in places that you will not even think to find. Sometimes it can be a simple phone call just to me from a woman who was a descendant from a Underground Railroad operative who just happened to live in Farmington, who found my name on the internet, and she found me, and helping her to understand what her ancestors had done for freedom. So I'm not going to read through this. You'll be able to see it, but this is what the quilt code looks like. how these symbols were put in, and these were supposed to be the quilts that were designed to help freedom seekers get over to Canada, and so forth and so forth, and just kind of stuck in some genre, and it makes it's a nice little piece of stuff. I mean, I like it, but for the most part, we cannot substantiate nor prove that this was actually used by any slaves that we are aware of. So what exactly was the Underground Railroad? It was a network of people, black, white, women, and men, and occasionally children. Because there are stories out there where children who are of age, 11, 12, 13 years old, who have left behind their memoirs of understanding they knew the work their parents were doing, and they actually knew, like, you know, when mama had a whole lot of pancakes on the table and told me don't worry about it, and you see mother walking out to the barn, these kind of primary sources do exist. But oftentimes they are difficult to get because sometimes they're still within the family themselves. So this is the southern part of Michigan, and this is not all of the networks, and I try to stay away from the word route because there was no permanent route in regards to the Underground Railroad. Sometimes fugitives had to move in various directions in order to get ahead of someone who potentially was on their heels, either the owners or the people the owner may have hired, like slave catchers, to come to Michigan to retrieve them. But this map was done by one of the leading historians of the 19th century who actually started documenting many of these old timers, the men and women and the freedom seekers. He started a survey, and he actually wrote a book, and his name is William Siebert. And Siebert has done this for all of his states, and we kind of like claim him in the Midwest because he's the one that primarily has documented the Midwest. But still, even his information, you should always find a second source that can support even the work that he has done. So when it comes to Michigan, these just were some of this one route, which was a major, well, I'm staying away from the word route, that could come in from Chicago and travel what we call the modern day I-94. And that also was, I-94 pretty much run parallel with the train route. The Michigan Central also allowed escaped slaves to get on the trains in Chicago, because many people don't know that the Michigan Central line in the 19th century was owned by an abolitionist family. And the directive was, you just allow them to get on board. No questions asked, and even the employees working for Michigan Central knew that. So we can see that we've got Cass County, which is also one of Michigan black settlements, and we also have Quakers in that area who helps. But we know that there are other connections that come up from Ohio at other points. This is just a few. But as you can see, based upon Wilbert Siebert's work, we have activism in Monroe. We have activism, of course, in Ann Arbor. But Ann Arbor becomes a very important part. I call it a pivot point, because when Detroit was flooded with perhaps slave catchers on the riverfront, Ann Arbor becomes a pivoting point to move freedom seekers through Canton, Plymouth, Livonia. Even though we don't have a documented station here, we know the smoke is there. So one day, hopefully talking to you all, someone will find it. And I want you just to lock into memory this little city, try it here, Spruce, because it's in the presentation and we're going to come back to it a little later. But as you can see, your friends and your neighbors, Northville. And from Northville, look at who we have, right across baseline, Farmington. So this is based upon the data that the historian from, we'll forgive him, he's from the Ohio State University. But Siebert's collection you can get into. It's free, it's digitized, it's easy to work with, and it will be in my bibliography list for you. So let's get to moving. So this is one of the primary sources that I share with people when we think about slavery. All African Americans did not work in the fields. Slavery varied from geographical region to geographical region, but no matter what we may think, or one person may have been in a much better situation than another one. At the end of the day, African Americans want freedom. I want my own autonomy. I want to rule my life. Here's an ad from our first what? President of the United States. That's George Washington, looking for his enslaved female, and her name is here, a few lines down, Oni Maria Judd. Now, by today's standards, some people say, well, she was in a much better position, because she was like the president's wife, And what she was a dressmaker and designer. Everything the First Lady, Lady Washington, wore while she was in their home, it was designed by Oni Judd. But even Oni still, too, wanted her own freedom. She designed for the elite in that kind of community that George Washington exists in. But at the end of the day, she, too, still wanted to have her own personal autonomy. So what were the reasons for escape? They could be either a physical or psychological punishment, and most definitely loss and death of an owner was an extremely scary time for enslaved peoples on plantations. Sexual assault, men, women, and children. Loss of a family unit. Women did not have no control over their bodies. Enslaved women, remember, they are property, and remember that children follow the condition of their mothers. So if the mothers were free, then the kids were free. But if the mother was enslaved, the child was enslaved, even if the child was the owner's child. Loss of family, also being sold down the river was a really big fear for most people enslaved. And many of you probably have heard that kind of little jingle like down the river. And what that meant was being sold down the Mississippi River, being sold to plantations in Mississippi and Louisiana, where the conditions of slavery were absolutely horrendous, especially when cotton becomes king. And then last but not least, just escaping the system from oppression, period. But when people want to, once again, try to discuss the quote code with me, I'm not the best person for it, because I say, hear it from the mouth of the abolitionists themselves. This gentleman here his first name is Abram Power. The Power family is the family of Quakers who settle Farmington. They have land all throughout Farmington, and they own land here in Livonia. Where the modern day period, or the modern day place would be, the Powers owned land along, not Haggerty, the other road that starts with Halstead. They own land at Halstead and 8 Mile, where the modern day golf course is. And that's where their property was the Power family. But I just tell people, just hear it from the abolitionists themselves. So Abram travels through Oakland County, Wayne County, picking up supplies that the freedom seekers need. But just look at some of the words that he's penning in regards to the condition that they're in when they arrive. Deplorable, state of destitute, sick, without food, shivering, and in some cases in a state of nudity. So we have to really question that quote code now, because I just don't think if this is the condition they arrived in, they're going to leave a blanket on the line, or even the abolitionists themselves would leave something for them not to be covered. And he's not the only one who gives the feedback on what freedom seekers look like when they get to Canada. So once again, when we look at the issue of slavery, slavery is not a subject that is just African American, it's American history. Slavery is in all 13 of our colonies. Slavery is the glue that holds together the social, the cultural, political, and economic fabric of America. There's not too much in American history where slavery is not connected to. And once again, this is American history. But also freedom seekers are crossing all type of boundaries to leave the United States. Most people don't even know that there's a southern route of the Underground Railroad. For those who are enslaved in Texas, guess where they're going? Mexico. Because Mexico ends slavery just like Canada does, years before the system is ended in the United States. And we have to end it by way of a civil war. And so we have freedom seeker routes that also go toward the south, even Florida and even to the Caribbean islands. So it's a system of violent resistance that can lead to the death of enslaved as well as Underground Railroad operatives and supporters. All you have to do is read the story of, I forget his first name, last name is Lovejoy. He was a printer in Missouri, white printer, very radical abolitionist, and he was killed for the cause. Read the story of John Brown, who gave his life for the cause, and the ultimate for him was death. So white abolitionists could be punished as severely as well. This is just a quick read through in regards to what's happening. Why come to Michigan? It's called Michigan Fever at the time. We've got two great things that are happening. The carving out of what they call, sometimes I have a brain fart, the canal that opens up to make travel a lot easier in upstate New York to get here. We also have the North Erie Canal. Did somebody say it? Yeah, that's it, because sometimes, with age, you get sometimes a little foggy there. Erie Canal opens up, and when we talk about upstate New York, this is why many of these communities have, so many of your early pioneers are from different denominations of Christianity. Because in upstate New York, we have just finished what they call another one of these fiery situations called the Great Awakening. Great Awakening 2 happens. And what that is just a way of saying that Christianity was moving in a way to really move in a social justice movement. So many of those pioneers, and when you start looking at some of the census for Michigan, you can see where your places, where your pioneers are coming from. But a great majority are coming from New York, because they're crossing through the Erie Canal, and from there, they're on to the lakes and then on to Michigan. First stop, Detroit, because that's where the land deeds and the land contracts first start off in Detroit for not only for Western Wayne County. Also keep in mind, even within our own federal government, slavery is enshrined in the Constitution, and that's 1793 Fugitive Slave Act, where if individuals who are owned, they're supposed to be returned to their owner due haste. But not only is the federal government part of it, Michigan is too. So when the Michigan Territory is carved out, look what Michigan Territory has, black codes. If you were a free person of color, you would have to actually put up a $500 bounty to stay in the Michigan Territory. And 500s back then, that's about, I think, equivalent about 20,000, 25,000 in today's market. And bond, and just to prove that you were free. So Michigan Constitution is completed in 1835. We present it to the federal government, and we become an official state in 37. Some of your pioneers are also here before 1837. A lot of them are already here. What this is a map here is 1834, just to give you an idea geographically of where many of the farmers from upstate New York and other parts of Pennsylvania, where they were coming from and where they landed in Michigan. But what's interesting, look how dark Wayne County is. They're all throughout Wayne County, and then they branch out to the neighboring counties like Washtenaw as well as Oakland County. But part of the drive was what? Land, $1.25 an acre. And when they purchase land, they purchase land. When you look at some of the purchase agreements and some of those contracts, I mean, they're buying like anywhere between 400 acres to as much as 1,600. So it's the land. But eventually they parcel it out to family members. But it's just the point that they felt that also by this time in Michigan, most of our indigenous population, they have either self-removed themselves or they move further north. Some indigenous people move on to Canada because they just don't know what the trajectory will be for the state yet. But last but not least, who's coming to Michigan? It's not that it's just Quakers, it's mostly Quakers, Methodists, Presbyterians, some Catholics, but not many, Baptists. So we've got a modge podge of everything, Universalist, Unitarist. So we've got a good combination of several different religious groups, and they're settling in these communities because farming. So this is just a quick slide on Quakers, because those are some of the earliest people who come here to Livonia Township, are the Quakers. And they're an interesting group in regards to how they look at slavery. They're one of the earliest groups to denounce slavery in the 1600s. Now, most of your history books will tell you that the Quakers were the first group to denounce slavery, but they weren't. It was actually the Mennonites. But they don't get credit for it because who knows what a Mennonite is and who they are. And actually the Mennonites have the first articulation in America in the 1600s in regards to being anti-slavery. And how many of you knew that Ben Franklin was anti-slavery? Ben Franklin was actually the president of one of the very first anti-slavery societies. He's an interesting character. Slave owner, then, you know, he becomes against slavery. So now this is a Wilbert Seibert map out of his collection. You can get this too. And then this is probably one they put in the collection where he was actually doing some doodling. But what's always interesting to me is how when he couldn't figure things out, he just kind of said, well, you know, I kind of think they would have gone to Livonia, maybe up here out, but he most definitely knew that Farmington was documented. Why was Farmington used? Believe it or not, if you look over here, he has a brown dot. Farmington also is exchanging and sending fugitives to Southfield. Can you believe that, modern day Southfield? All of this was really a lot of the old timers who were abolitionists here. And the abolitionists who are visiting the area are saying the same thing. Oh, you know, I settled in this community and it's mostly abolitionists. And I'm quite sure there were some that are non-abolitionists. We know that they're not selling, but from what we're reading. But once again, look how Ann Arbor is documented. We also have a wonderful place here in Livonia, and if you haven't been there, please visit. And that's called Greenmead Historical Park. And Greenmead Historical Park is doing its best to preserve physical history of the entire history of Livonia Township and Livonia. It's just so happened that I work for them, and I only work in the collections dealing with the pioneers. You know, I like the old stuff. And we have a collection that is not yet available to the public because we're cataloging it and moving materials into it to make sure that when we have it together, that you can come there and really have an opportunity to look at it and take pictures and study it. But I want you to look at some of the names at the bottom. Do some of those look familiar? Have you ever heard of them? Laphams, DeGarmo, Power. Those are your Quaker families. Not an intensive list, but those are some of your Quaker families here in Livonia Township. And the original Quaker church for Farmington, there was one in Farmington and one in Livonia. But there was a difference between the two Quaker groups. Farmington was Orthodox. They were more traditional. They did assist and help with the anti-slavery, abolitionist, and Underground Railroad movement. But the Quakers who really did a lot of work were your Hicksites, because slavery also split church denominations. Like some of you might know and hear, and you heard of the name Marcus Swift. And usually he gets credit with what we call the Westland area because that's where he lived. But he actually was all throughout this area because he was a circuit minister. So he rode the circuit in regards to this area and parts of southern Oakland County. And we're going to talk about him as well because Marcus Swift also is active in the movement. But I'm going to switch up right quick and go back to this building. Has anyone ever gone to Greenmead and seen this building? So that is the Hicksite Quaker House. It's still on the campus, and the organization, Greenmead Historical Village, we do occasionally have programs there. I think several years ago I did a lecture in there just on the Quakers. So make sure you watch Greenmead's schedule, and make sure you know the rest of this schedule, because tonight this is part one of part three, a three-part series that the library and Greenmead is running. So now we get to Livonia Township Quakers. So we know that you guys have a branch called the Hicksites. We have the Orthodox in Farmington, but remember, they're still family members. So whether they're Orthodox or whether they're Hicksites, it really doesn't matter. They were all working in the same goal of assisting and helping freedom seekers to get to freedom. So the Hicksites over here were also aggressive in regards to very radicalized, as what some of the 19th century newspapers will say, that they were radicalized abolitionists, but also many of them supported a freedom seeker settlement in Canada called the Canadian Refugee Society. We're going to take a look at that. So here are two nice looking gentlemen, handsome old devils, okay. These are half brothers. And from here forward in the presentation, you might see some individuals who got that cool little gold star. That means that an application was written to the Department of Interior to a program called Network to Freedom. And there was an application probably submitted somewhere in the ballpark of 25 to 50 pages long, because you have to prove and reprove the story that that particular person was actually an Underground Railroad station manager or operative. And guess what we have here? The gentleman that's on your right, he goes by Erastus Hussey. You can Google him on your phone and see all the stories that he leaves behind information talking about he helped about 1,000 freedom seekers. He settles on the Plymouth side, right there at the line, which is now, what is it, Haggerty? Is it Haggerty? I get Haggerty and Hallstatt mixed up. It's Haggerty. So he's right at the line of the division between the two townships. But even in the collections, when I read through the materials of some of the pioneering families at Greenmead, many of them got their mail in Plymouth. They would complain about the mail service in Livonia Township and just say, oh, just send it to Plymouth. So these are very fluid borders, other than them functioning as individual townships. But the gentleman next to him is his half-brother, Cyrus Fuller. Now, Cyrus, we have not been able to document him in regards to helping freedom seekers, but boy, he was active in the movement. Not just him, but the rest of his brothers too. It's about 3 or 4 of them that all exist. But you know, sometimes you have to, sometimes I'll make some claims, even if I haven't proved them yet. Well, if Big Brother is moving fugitives in Battle Creek, because he eventually moves to Battle Creek about 10 years later, I know my family's over there in Plymouth, Farmington, in Livonia. Sometimes we can make some, and sometimes if I write like that, I'll just say the claim hasn't been proven. I'll just say that there's a high probability that more than likely the brother and the Fullers were also engaging in moving freedom seekers through this region, because they would have had to come through here, because if Farmington is documented, they would have had to have some kind of movement through this part of Western Wayne County. Also, I just show you here, even though it's a bad slide to read, but actually some of your abolitionists had black people living with them. I only gave you one example. I think this is from the 60 census, but I have blacks living in Livonia Township, and they're living with prominent abolitionists. Now, if I know I'm a black person, and if I know if I hadn't declared whether I'm free or a slave, but if I'm a slave, who am I gonna live with? I'm just saying, who am I gonna live with? And look at that last name, Fuller. So some of it has to be partly common sense. Sometimes when we don't have those kind of permanent documents we're looking for, just as a historian, if you're gonna make the claim, just try to back it up with other kinds of things, the behaviors of the abolitionists. The abolitionists in Livonia Township were also active politically. How many know that the Republican Party was founded in Michigan, Jackson, Michigan? That's where, forget Wisconsin. They try to claim it too, but we had the party here. So keep in mind that the Republican Party is carved from the Liberation, or the Liberty Party, which was an anti-slavery party. That came from free soil. So what happens is when all of those parties dissolve and they make the now new Republican Party, we also have what we call Democrats who no longer want to be Democrats also are part of the membership of the new Republican Party. And the Republican Party does something really interesting here in Michigan, and we will get to that too. So here we have, once again, and I also like to show women, because sometimes women are hidden in this literature. They're often, because we get the stories of the men. Because if the men are over here with wagons collecting goods, who do you think is organizing them? The women. So you have a very active woman here in Livonia Township. And her name, who she married to? A Fuller. And even her own family, the Garmos, are also active in the anti-slavery movement. But she is actually a very prominent and very important person in the Michigan Anti-Slavery Society. There are two societies that exist. The first one that's organized is the Michigan State, and it dissolves around the 1840s, 1850s, and then this one takes over. But the difference is this branch is a branch from William Lord Garrison out of Boston. So that we call his followers Garrisonians. And here we have, and look what star he has. He has that special star. He has been documented as an actual Underground Railroad station master in Farmington, Nathan Power. And didn't I just tell you that the Powers had land in Livonia? So I'm working on some things, and because the one family member, you have several Powers over here, but the person who I'm more interested in that I think I'll get close with documentation is his brother, big brother, called Ira, I-R-A, Ira Power. And Ira Power owns a lot of land up there where the golf course is. Now, here's what's interesting. The Power family, because some scholars some years ago did a book on the Quakers in Michigan. Their history is very difficult to track, because if anyone who has dived into Quaker history, it has to do with their monthly meetings. And their meetings are all over the place, and sometime the group is here, sometime they're in Adrian, sometime they're in Raisin, sometime they're in Ohio. But what happens with Nathan is he never leaves the Orthodox movement. His behavior is Hicksite, but he stays with the Orthodox because he's doing things that your Quakers in Livonia were doing, where there was no middle ground for slavery, period. No middle ground for it. They wanted immediate emancipation. That's why they were called radicals and purists. As well as they refused to hold or have any affiliation with any church that endorsed or would not allow African Americans to join as members. And look at Nathan. He's president of the Farmington Township, and he's vice president for Oakland County Anti-Slavery Society, and he is buried in the Quaker Cemetery on the Farmington side, along with even some of your members of your Quakers in Livonia Township. They're buried over in Farmington. So here's Southfield. Who would ever thought? Southfield. Who would ever thought? And this is the minister who was acting against the laws. and his name is too long to pronounce. We just call him JST. He's a Calvinist, and just like I think they were a little bit more aggressive than, not a little bit, I know they were a lot more aggressive than the Hicksites. And believe it or not, this is my dissertation topic, the Reformed Presbyterian Church of America and their commitment to ending slavery and the work that they did. Fascinating. Violent, clubs, guns. They have left behind a record of things like they dared anyone to come up on them as they were transporting fugitives in wagons, because they would take a gun to them without any questions. So because they're Calvinists, and Calvinists believe that that no human being can own a person. And the Calvinists also are steeply biblical scholars, and they say that slavery is like man stealing, and man stealing is a sin, which many of the other religious organizations involved in this movement participate in. But guess what? Next time you drive through Southfield, the church is still standing. If you ever travel on Evergreen Road, where the library is, right before you get to the Highway 696, there's a very unassuming white building, and that's where they are today. They don't have any kind of idols, crosses. They're very purist in their presentation in regards to, so they would love to have people come over and fellowship with them. So I've had the opportunity to travel to their other churches and unearth other stories about this organization, and the dissertation should be quite interesting. So once again, we get other members of the Power family, but look at Amy. Look what happens with the Quakers we just disowned her. That's an easy way of saying we just not going to allow her to be a member, because she moves over and she becomes part of Livonia Township because she's a Hicksite. I already talked about Ira, because he does the same thing. And these are the actual wordings from the historical document. And the document saying we disowned him because he did not attend the Orthodox Quaker meetings. And then last but not least, I think Abram got kicked out too. So several of the Orthodox Farmington members, that's why they're here in Livonia Township. Because eventually Abram also owns land here too in the township as well. And so these are the example of Garrisonians. So the Garrisonians, once again, they didn't obey no laws, no allegiance to the flag, nothing. They didn't even vote. Purists didn't vote. My group, the Covenanters, they didn't vote. But once again, the biggest factor here is their immediate release from slavery. And Garrison actually runs that organization from Boston, and we have the chapter of many of the Hicksites who are following. Not only are they Hicksite Quakers, but they're also what we call Garrisonian followers. How many probably have passed this building? How many times? 6 Mile, beautiful little building, and has little graves. Have you ever been curious? It was originally called the Union/sometime Briggs. I've seen it both ways in historical documents, but I'll just call it the Union Meeting House. It was a non-denominational meeting house, and it is still in Farmington today. And we have all kind of musical productions and small plays and things at now what we call the Trinity Music House. But this is what it looked like in, I think, about 1970 when the city owned it. And I think the city still owns it, but it has a special agreement with Trinity House. So if they decide not to no longer exist, I'm gonna bug the city to make that our Underground Railroad Museum. You down for that? Yeah. All right. I'll need some help. Who said yeah? I'm looking for you. You got me? Okay. All right. So once again, so what's happening right here at 6 Mile? I think it's just barely east of the Highway 696. But if you live in this area, you probably have seen it and have gone past it several times. There are all kind of meetings that are taking place in that little place. Look at the one over there to the far right. There's an annual meeting of what they call the Progressive Friends. Those are your Quakers and their friends having meetings. I'm asking the whole questions all the way to the end. They're having meetings, look, at the Union Meeting House. And what the Progressive Friends were, this was a group of your most radical abolitionists from Western Wayne County and Lower Oakland County. And what they were doing was getting ready to set up and start a settlement in Canada. And I'll tell you what that settlement is and with who. But look at the names at the bottom. Abigail, Lapham. Laphams are living in Farmington, and they're living here. And the Powers are related to the Laphams by way of marriage. Because in this time, people didn't travel very far to find spouses. You find people in the neighborhood. And birds of a feather, what do they normally do? They normally flock together. So you have abolitionist families marrying into one another. So this document is available also. I think you would have to get this to a library to get to this newspaper, the Anti-Slavery Bugle. But guess who's also an agent for them? Remember that name I told you earlier? Harriet DeGarmo Fuller? She's an agent for this anti-slavery newspaper in Ohio. So if you want to hear more about her, you'll have to come to the presentation on her in March 26th at Greenmead. And that we'll be talking about. And we decided to pull her back just to give us some time between presentations and just to also honor her for Women's History Month. Okay. So guess who else was in your community? I think everybody knows this famous photo, don't they? Who is that? Sojourner, yeah, girl, Sojourner was up in your neighborhood. Yes. Yeah, but look where she was at. That Union Meeting House. Because the Union Meeting House held a few what they call annual conventions. I don't know how they all fit in that little place. And that's before you see the expansion now, but they did. So they actually was the host of the Michigan State anti-slavery conferences over there in that building. And she shows up. She's part of the conference and she actually sings. So she too is traveling in your community as well as in Farmington. We have her documented there as well. This is a well-known person in the literature. He is born free, Cooper is, but he is also a free-born African-American who also is working in the anti-slavery movement. And guess where he shows up? Not just at the Union House, he shows up at several places in Livonia. So he's here on a traveling tour with the young lady who's next to him, Frances Ellen Wilkins. I'm thinking of the Wilkins Farm in Royal Oak. Sometimes I do too much lecturing. That's another story over there. But they're freeborn, but they also jump in to the anti-slavery and abolitionist movement. But look at who they are visiting, the Fullers in Plymouth. Because sometimes even the primary documents can be wrong because Plymouth and Livonia's name is often switched back and forth in regards to locations. But look at who they are visiting over here. They're visiting down in Northville. You ever heard of the last name Durfee? These are all early abolitionist families. Uh-oh, how many times have we passed that name, Lapham? Few times. It's right there in the middle and of the presentation as well. And I know the Waltons are over in Farmington, and both families are related to the Powers. The Powers genealogy even go as far as, I've done genealogy on them, they go as far as Lenawee County. But it would make sense, because Lenawee County has a pretty healthy community of Quakers as well. Oh, there we go again. I think I enlarged it for you so you guys could see it. So once again, who's in Plymouth? But we know the Fullers are where? Livonia. Two very important national speakers are right here in your community. And they were on what they call their Western tour. Can you believe that Michigan was considered the Western tour? And we also want to talk a little bit about the Liberator. So when people say, oh, well, you know, the Underground Railroad was quiet. No, it wasn't. After a certain point, by the 1830s, they knew who each other was because they was talking to one another in these papers. The Liberator, and you know, anybody could have picked these up, just that they would have had to be able to figure out who was doing what and where. But all of these individuals, you can track them through politics, through the church, as well as through the anti-slavery newspaper. And we have had several of them here in Michigan. in different parts of the state. Oh, here we go again. Here's 1850. So this is the year that the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law becomes active. What happened, what makes this one different from the one from 1793, it requires all white citizens to turn in fugitives. So in other words, it makes everybody responsible for turning in fugitives. Well, Michigan did something a little different, and I don't think I have it on this slide. When the legislation became Republican in 1855, one of the first things the Republicans did was develop a state law called the Personal Liberty Act, which nullified the federal act. So now you want to know why we have so many problems between where do state and federal rights begin and end. You know, it's in our blood as a nation. That's where it starts. But once again, here, this is, I think, an African-American, yep, we have one person of African-American descent where the arrow is, living with the Hollicks. And none of the Hollicks were active abolitionists. Then down here, it looks like you also have pretty much an entire family. And how I know is the check marks denote that they were either black or mulatto. Living with who? Let's see. I think that's the Blanchard family, and they too are documented somehow in the abolitionist movement. This slide was a little bit foggy, but I think this is 1862, the 1860 census. But once again, many blacks were living with the farmers because farmers needed workers. And we have the same thing that's happening in Oakland County right about this time. But in this particular case, the farmers didn't adhere to the federal law. They adhered to the 1855 Michigan Personal Liberty Act. Because what the Liberty Act does is it gives the freedom seekers, we pay for representation for them, lawyers. They can have a voice in court now. They can bring witnesses, and Michigan will not lock them up like prior to. So what happens is, when someone comes to the state and claims someone as their property, they have due process in Michigan after 1855. So you know what happens. Because if you're not going to keep them locked up, okay, I'll see you in a few days for the trial. By then they're gone. They're off to Canada. What this slide here is at the top, that's 8 Mile Road, and I just wanted to show you some of the properties of some of your abolitionists that I have documented. I have people I suspect, like the Simmons family, but I just haven't found the primary source to connect them. The only thing I can connect the Simmons family to, because that cemetery at the Union, at Trinity, that's an abolitionist cemetery. They're all buried there. And some of the members of the Simmons families are buried there. So there's some connection, but I just haven't been able to put the glue to the paper to make it stick, okay? That settlement, I told you that some of the abolitionists in Oakland County and Western Wayne County helped to financially support. It was this gentleman's who started it, and there were two organizations, one on the Canadian side and one on the American side, and many of the abolitionists from Oakland County and Western Wayne County, they were on the planning seed for what they call the Canadian Refugee Home Society. Because one of the things that refugees were suffering from, and don't think that Canada was a walk in the park. They were free, but Canada too had its limits in regards to what it would and what it did not do for freedom seekers. So it took churches and it took the black settlements to help the individuals coming to Canada. But you know, when you start reading this material, you can see who's hanging out with who, because you have Nathan Power. You know, if the Powers are here, the rest of them are here. There are other Powers who are involved in this, but they're just not documented in this article. But if you look down at the bottom, there's a name by the name of Robert, but it's cut off, R-O-B, and it says Carver, but that's Robert Gardner. And I'm currently writing the application for the Gardner family, who were also active on the Underground Railroad, but guess where they live? White Lake, Michigan. You know that's north, and that's bordering Lapeer and whatnot. And their brothers are also involved with Henry Bibb. Henry Bibb is a former escaped slave. He escapes 3 times, and 2 of them that are unsuccessful. And I'm going to move on so we can get the Q&As. So once again, this just goes to show you how the abolition is here along with Western Wayne County. And the reason why I know, because you do this research long enough, you just know. There's a name down here at the bottom that says S. Zug. He did not physically put his hands on freedom seekers. He was a financial backer. He lived in Detroit and he was extremely rich. There's a church in Detroit, Fort Street Presbyterian Church. It's on Fort Road, Gothic church, beautiful church. That's where most of your rich abolitionists attended, because they broke away from the Presbyterian church, and the church itself was anti-slavery. So Zug was a member of that church, and then the name last but not least, George the Baptiste. That was the leading black man in Detroit who was helping and organizing freedom seekers on the riverfront. This is just an article about Bibb, but look whose names pop up there. Natkins, Marcus Swift, who's in this community of Western Wayne County. And then Halleck's name is down at the bottom. Remember, he had a person of color. We don't know what their status is, but there's a person of color living on their property as well. So as I come to a closing, we can see that how many of your Livonia Township residents that lived in a certain particular geographical area were highly active in regards to some role of having a role of importance of trying to rid slavery as well as being abolitionists. There's Henry Bibb's name again. He's jumping in because Bibb is also lecturing on this side of the aisle. I didn't do too many slides on Marcus Swift because he is the first program at Greenmead on February 26th. And I'll unfold his story, unravel his story about how and why he became a member, because when he comes to Michigan, he's a Methodist Episcopal, and they pretty much just don't do some nice things with him, along with a friend named Samuel Bibbins, and I'll tell you about their journey. So join me at Greenmead on the 26th of this month, same time, and it's actually going to be in the Newburgh Church. So and the Newburgh Church is one of the churches that are on the campus, and it's also a church that he ministered at. Okay. Oh, Southfield, there they go again. So once again, as you can see, even as some of Cooper, as he's traveling, look who he's staying with. He's staying with JST in Southfield. And I'm quite sure they've had those conversations. Well, when you leave here, where are you going? Oh, I'm going to Livonia to visit the who? The Fullers. The connections, if you can find the sources, are there. This is also just another meeting to show you, the meeting house again involved in a progressive friend, I like that title, Progressive Friends, Progressive Friends meeting. And once again, we see their names laid out at the bottom. All this stuff is still, it needs additional research. So I'm open to anyone who want to jump in and help so that we can continue to get Livonia as part of the narrative of what happens. Because who gets the credit for Wayne County is Detroit. So that's why I'm so passionate about the counties out this way, to make sure that our stories are told as well. And once again, this is just showing you Liberty Party meetings, which also were, this is the seed, the Liberty Party is the seed to the Republican Party. And remember, this is an anti-slavery party. That's what they were founded on. So this is just a list of sources that I have for you. Some you can find at your local library. Some of them you might have to go to U of M and get and see. And we have a small collection at Greenmead, but it's not searchable yet for the public. And I've just been trying to put those documents in one places. But here are the links that you'll have access to in regards to if you want to search some of those digitized sources, like the one that says Ohio Memories, that's the Seibert collection. You can pop in it, put in a word, you can say the word Michigan, you can put Livonia. If the letter or something was written, it's a really good website, digitized collection. And last but not least, how do I do this history? Wow, you see it. So many different ways you have to go at it. You just can't study in one direction. And then last but not least, I'll come back to this slide and leave it up for the night. For anyone who is really interested after tonight and you want to travel into learning more about this history, probably for someone, if this is new for you, I would tell you to start off with Carol Mall's book, The Underground Railroad in Michigan. Small little reader, but it will give you a very broad story of who was active in the state of Michigan on the Underground Railroad or abolitionist movement. If you're interested in slavery in early Detroit, yes, Michigan did have slavery. This is a good read too here, The Dawn of Detroit, and I'm trying to get you the ones that are Detroit focused. Probably the top, yeah, everything on the top row is Michigan. The first 5 are Detroit and state, and then also the last one is state, written by a scholar about a multi-ethnic community in the western side of the state called Covert. That is a good read. And then the other ones, this one is a really good one, The Slave's Cause, because it's like a big encyclopedia about what is the movement all about. Okay, with that being said, I think I'm done, and I will open this up for you all. And that's William Lambert over there, and this is George the Baptiste, who were the key Underground Railroad operatives in Detroit, helping when Oakland and Western Wayne County were bringing freedom seekers to Detroit. These were the 2 men primarily, along with the third one. We've just unearthed the third individual, along with there were some other places too, some other individuals, but they were the key, because he leaves behind a biography in a newspaper article and talks about the work that he did in Detroit. So what you can do is you can always reach out to me through email. You can leave messages for me at Green Mead, and I'll just leave this up at the end, and I will be quiet because I've been talking for about an hour, and I will take your questions and answers. Thank you.